I inherited my mother's storage locker after she died. When I went to clear it out, I found a locked metal box I had never seen before. Inside was $1.4 million in cash, and a handwritten letter addressed to a name I didn't recognize. Hello and welcome back. I'm Vivian, and I'm glad you're here with me today. If this is your first time, please subscribe and leave a comment letting me know where in Canada you're listening from, or anywhere else in the world. I love knowing how far these stories travel. People ask me sometimes how I ended up in the middle of something so much larger than myself. The honest answer is that I didn't go looking for it. It came to me through grief, the way most unexpected things do. My name is Lydia Marsh. I'm 43 years old, and I live in Hamilton, Ontario, in the same neighborhood where I grew up, which is either comforting or embarrassing depending on the day. 2 years ago, I was a freelance bookkeeper with a mid-size client list, a 12-year-old Honda Civic, and a recently signed lease on a 2-bedroom apartment I'd moved into alone after the end of a 7-year relationship. My ex-partner, Marcus, had not been unkind when we separated. He had simply been very clear that he wanted children, and I had finally been honest enough with both of us to admit that I didn't. We had parted without cruelty and with a great deal of residual sadness, and I had spent the better part of the following year reorganizing my life around the space his absence had left. My mother, Ruth Marsh, died in February. She was 71, and it was a stroke, fast and without much warning. I had seen her for Christmas 6 weeks before, and she had seemed fine. Tired, maybe. A little more quiet than usual. I had made a note to call more often, and then had not called more often, and now she was gone. And that note was something I would carry for a long time. She had lived alone since my father passed 12 years ago in a small house in Ancaster that we sold through the estate in the spring. The process of settling her affairs was the particular kind of slow, administrative grief that doesn't look like grief from the outside, but hollows you out just the same. Forms, phone calls, the cancellation of accounts and subscriptions, the careful, necessary sorting of a life into keep, donate, discard. It was during that sorting that I found the storage locker key. It was in the back of her kitchen junk drawer, on a ring with a faded plastic tag that said Hammond Storage Unit 14. I had no idea she had a storage locker. My mother was not a woman who kept things. She had been aggressively practical her entire life, the kind of person who donated items the moment they stopped being useful and who had once told me that clutter was just postponed decision-making. A storage locker was so contrary to everything I knew about her that I stood in her kitchen for a long moment just looking at the key. Hammond Storage was a small facility on the east side of Hamilton, the kind of place with a gravel lot and a keypad gate and rows of orange roll-up doors. I went on a Thursday morning in early April. The woman at the front desk confirmed that my mother had been renting Unit 14 for 9 years, and that the account was paid annually in advance and current until October. 9 years. My mother had been paying for a storage locker for 9 years without ever mentioning it to me. The unit was 10 by 10. Inside was a set of shelving units along one wall, 2 plastic storage bins with lids, a cardboard box sealed with packing tape, and in the far corner, a gray metal cash box, the kind you buy at a hardware store, padlocked with a combination lock. The bins held what you'd expect from someone's mother: old photographs in envelopes, a few items of sentimental jewelry I recognized from childhood, my parents' wedding album, some letters bundled with elastic bands, things that were private but not mysterious, things that made a kind of sense. The metal cash box did not make sense, not the size of it. It was larger than a standard cash box, more like a small portable safe maybe 18 inches across, and not the lock, which was heavy and deliberate in a way that suggested it was protecting something worth protecting. I did not have the combination. I sat on the concrete floor of that storage unit for longer than I would like to admit, looking at that box, and then I took it home in the back seat of my Civic, which was a decision I made without fully thinking through. The way you make certain decisions when you're grieving, and the ordinary rules of caution feel less relevant than they usually do. A locksmith opened it the following morning. He didn't ask questions. I had told him it was my mother's and I'd lost the combination, which was true enough. Inside was money. Banded stacks of bills, 50s and 100s, organized neatly, the way someone methodical had packed them. And underneath the money, in a plain white envelope sealed with a small strip of tape, was a letter. The letter was not addressed to me. It was addressed to someone named Thomas Aldridge. I didn't count the money that day. I wasn't ready for that information yet. I put everything back in the box, put the box in my bedroom closet, and sat down at my kitchen table with a cup of tea that went cold while I stared at the wall. My mother had kept a box of cash and a letter addressed to a stranger in a storage locker she had never told me about for 9 years. I had buried her 11 weeks ago. I could not ask her anything. What I could do was think, and I was very good at thinking when I was frightened. It was one of the things people found unnerving about me in a crisis, that I went quiet and still and methodical rather than reactive. My ex-partner Marcus had called it a gift. My mother had called it a coping mechanism. They were probably both right. I opened the letter the next morning. It was 2 pages, handwritten in my mother's neat, slanted script. She had always had beautiful handwriting, the kind taught in schools that no longer taught it that way. Reading it felt like hearing her voice, which made reading it almost unbearable. The letter explained that the money, she did not state the amount, had been placed in trust by her and was intended for Thomas Aldridge in the event that certain things she described as the arrangement came to an end, or in the event of her death. She wrote that Thomas would know what she meant. She wrote that she was sorry she had never been able to explain this properly, and that she hoped the money was enough to cover what she had always felt was her share of the obligation. Her share of the obligation. That phrase sat in the middle of the letter like a stone in still water. I had no idea what the obligation was. I had no idea who Thomas Aldridge was. I had no idea what arrangement my mother had been party to for apparently 9 or more years that required her to maintain a secret cash reserve and a letter addressed to a man I had never heard her mention. I went back to my kitchen table and I made a list of what I knew. It was a short list. I had always found that lists helped. I counted the money that afternoon. It took me 2 hours because I was careful, and I counted everything twice, the way I do everything involving numbers. The total was $147,000. Not the life-altering sum I had braced myself for, somehow, but not a small amount either. $147. So zero in cash in a locked box in a storage locker that my mother had been paying $180 a month to maintain. Over 9 years, she had spent more than $19,000 just on the storage fees. Whatever the obligation was, she had been committed to it. The next morning, I started looking for Thomas Aldridge. I am a bookkeeper. Finding things in records is what I do. I started with public records, property registrations, business registrations, corporate filings. The name Thomas Aldridge appeared in a 2009 business registration in Ontario for a small company called Aldridge Cartage, a transport brokerage based in Brantford. The company had been dissolved in 2014. There was no current listing I could find, No active address, no professional registration. I found an obituary in the Brantford Expositor, dated March 2021, for a Douglas Aldridge, age 77, described as a retired transport industry professional, survived by his wife Margaret and his son, Thomas Aldridge of Brantford. So Thomas Aldridge existed. His father had recently died. He had operated a now-dissolved transport brokerage. He and my mother had shared something they called an arrangement. I sat with this for several days. I went to work. I submitted payroll filings for 2 of my clients. I went to the grocery store. I called my cousin Beverly on a Sunday evening, which I did most Sundays, and talked about nothing in particular for 40 minutes. I did not tell Beverly about the box. Then I called a lawyer. The lawyer I found was named Patricia Holloway. She practiced out of a small firm in Burlington specializing in estate law and what her website called financial disputes arising from non-standard inheritance situations. I had spent 3 evenings reading her case summaries before I decided she was the right person. When I called her, the first thing she asked after I'd explained the situation was whether I had moved the money from the storage locker. I told her I had. She paused. Then she said, "Well, let's talk through this carefully." Patricia Holloway was a tall woman in her early 50s with a calm, direct manner that reminded me, painfully, of my mother. She listened to me describe everything in her boardroom and took notes in a narrow, precise hand. When I finished, she leaned back and said, "The first question is the source, because $147, 00 in cash stored outside the banking system for an extended period creates questions that need answers before you can do anything else with it legally or practically." She advised me that my situation as my mother's sole heir meant I had arguably inherited whatever this arrangement was, including its complications. She also advised me that if the money had any connection to unreported income or other irregular financial activity, the Canada Revenue Agency would have a significant interest, and that getting ahead of that interest proactively was far better than waiting for it to find me. She recommended I not contact Thomas Aldridge until we had a clearer picture of what we were dealing with. I agreed with her reasoning. She recommended I retain a forensic accountant to assess whether the cash showed any patterns of suspicious origin. I agreed with that too. What I didn't tell her yet, because I needed to think about it more, was that while I'd been searching public records for Thomas Aldridge, I had found something else. My mother had been a bookkeeper too, a sole proprietor for 30 years, small business clients, nothing unusual. But among the business registrations I'd pulled while searching, I had found her name listed as an administrator on a numbered company registered in 2010. A numbered company I had never heard of, had never seen in any of her records, and which had been dissolved quietly in 2021. The same year Thomas Aldridge's father had died. My mother had been connected to a numbered company connected by timing to the Aldridge family, and neither of these things had ever appeared anywhere I would have known to look. I told Patricia Holloway about the numbered company at our second meeting. She went very still for a moment, then said, "Okay, that's significant. Tell me everything you know about it." The numbered company, 21849903 Ontario Inc., had been registered in 2010 and had listed my mother, Ruth Marsh, as administrator and a man named Douglas Aldridge, Thomas's father's as sole director. It had no publicly listed business purpose. It had filed no business name registration, which meant it had operated under its number only. It had dissolved in 2021. Patricia explained that numbered companies operating under their registration number with no public business name were not inherently suspicious. Small holding companies, informal investment vehicles, and estate planning tools all sometimes operated this way. But in combination with the cash, the letter, and the timing of the dissolution, coinciding with Douglas Aldridge's death, it warranted investigation. She made contact through her own networks, carefully, professionally, and within a week confirmed that 2184903 Ontario Inc. had at one point held a real property in Norfolk County, a rural parcel that had been sold in 2018, and that the proceeds of that sale had not appeared in any of the records associated with my mother's estate. Property sold in 2018, proceeds not accounted for. My mother had died in 2021 with a modest estate. The Ancaster house, her RRSP, her bank accounts. She had been comfortable, not wealthy, if she'd received proceeds from a property sale through this company. Where had those proceeds gone? I thought about that for a long time, and then, slowly, the shape of it began to come together. My mother had been part of something with Douglas Aldridge, something that had generated money in ways that didn't flow through normal channels. She had felt it was an obligation. When Douglas died, she had prepared the cash as her share, the thing she owed or believed she owed to his son, who had presumably been left out of whatever arrangement his father had made. I did not know whether what they had done was illegal. I was increasingly certain it was at least irregular, and I knew that the $147,000 in that box was the piece of it that had landed in my lap, belonging now to neither the person who'd set it aside nor the person it was meant for, held in a closet in my apartment in Hamilton, growing more complicated by the day. It was Patricia who told me, a week later, that Thomas Aldridge had filed a notice of intent to pursue a claim against my mother's estate. I hadn't contacted him. Someone else had, or he had found the estate filing through public records, which were public. He knew Ruth Marsh had died. He knew she'd had an estate, and he had a lawyer. His lawyer's name was Kevin Drury of Drury and Associates in Brantford. Patricia knew of him. Her assessment was brief. He's effective, and he doesn't typically take cases without merit. So Thomas Aldridge had filed a claim with a lawyer who didn't take cases without merit, which meant he believed he had a right to something from my mother's estate, which meant he knew about the arrangement, which meant he had probably been waiting. I am not a person who panics. I want to be clear about that, because what happened over the following weeks could sound like something a panicking person might do, and I don't think that's accurate. I was frightened, yes. I was also angry in a way I hadn't expected, not at Thomas Aldridge specifically, not yet, but at the situation itself, at my mother's silence, at the 9 years of storage locker payments and carefully maintained secrets that had compressed themselves into this particular problem and dropped it directly into my life at a moment when I was already hollowed out by losing her. But I did not panic. I documented everything. I opened a dedicated folder on my laptop and filed every record, every receipt, every letter in chronological order. I photographed the cash before it went to the forensic accountant. I kept notes of every conversation with Patricia, time-stamped and detailed. Precision, in my experience, is the thing you reach for when everything else is uncertain. The forensic accountant's name was Stuart Obie. He was a specialist in tracing unreported financial flows and had done work for both the CRA and private litigants. Patricia recommended him. He came to her office to review the cash and my mother's financial records and he spent 3 weeks doing things I didn't entirely understand with financial documentation that I did understand entirely, because bookkeeping is, at its core, the same work regardless of scale. His report came back in June. Most of the $147,000 could not be connected to any identifiable source in my mother's financial records, which was what made it complicated. But one portion, approximately $31,000, showed characteristics consistent with cash proceeds from commercial real estate transactions that had not been reported to the CRA as income. The remaining $116,000 was, to use Stewart's careful professional language, of ambiguous origin but not traceable to any known illegal source. Patricia walked me through what this meant. The $31,000 was problematic. It likely represented unreported income, which created a tax liability for my mother's estate and potentially for me as her heir. We would need to file a voluntary disclosure with the CRA to get ahead of it. The $116,000 was murkier, not provably clean, not provably dirty, origin unknown. And Thomas Aldridge's claim was for $147,000, all of it. His lawyer, Kevin Drury, had filed documents asserting that the funds represented Douglas Aldridge's contribution to a joint venture with my mother, that Douglas had died without access to his share, and that Thomas, as his heir, was entitled to recover that share from my mother's estate. I read those documents 3 times. Then I put them down and looked at my kitchen window for a while. The maple in the backyard was fully leafed by then, deep summer green. A robin was doing something aggressive in the lawn. Thomas Aldridge was not wrong that his father had been part of a joint venture with my mother. He was not wrong that his father had died. What he was claiming through his lawyer's careful language was that the entirety of the cash in that box belonged to his family's side of whatever the arrangement had been. But my mother's letter, addressed to Thomas, never sent, said she was providing her share of the obligation. Her share, not the whole thing, not a recovery of his father's contribution, something she herself owed. I gave the letter to Patricia. She read it twice, slowly. Then she said, "This is important, Lydia. This changes the framing of the claim significantly. Your mother didn't believe she was holding Thomas Aldridge's money. She believed she was setting aside money she owed him. Those are legally very different positions. The voluntary disclosure to the CRA was filed in July. It was not a comfortable process. It meant formally acknowledging that my mother's estate had a tax liability arising from unreported income, paying a portion of it immediately, and entering into a repayment arrangement for the remainder. The CRA officer assigned to the file was businesslike and not unkind. He had seen this before. He had seen considerably more flagrant versions of this before. I sat in Patricia's office after the disclosure was filed and felt something I couldn't immediately name. Not relief, exactly. More like the particular weight that comes when you've done the right thing and it's cost you something real, and you're certain it was still correct. The estate would pay back just under $14.00 in tax liability. That would come from the funds in the box. It was the right outcome. It was also uncomfortable. The civil proceeding on Thomas Aldridge's claim was scheduled for September. In the weeks before, Patricia and Kevin Drury engaged in the careful adversarial exchange of documents that is litigation's most reliable feature. Kevin was professional and persistent. Patricia was methodical and, as I would come to understand, quietly formidable. In August, 2 things happened. The first was that Patricia obtained, through a court order, the financial records for 21-840-903 Ontario Inc. going back to its registration. What those records showed was that the company had held two properties over its lifetime: the Norfolk County parcel that sold in 2018, and a second, smaller parcel in Haldimand County that had been sold in 2013. The combined net proceeds from both sales, after costs and the company's minimal operating expenses, came to approximately $390,000. My mother had received her administrative fee for each transaction. Douglas Aldridge, as sole director, had received the balance. Douglas Aldridge had received approximately $340, zero from this company, over its lifetime, in controlled, documented transactions. Thomas Aldridge's claim that the $147,000 in my mother's storage locker represented his father's unpaid contribution to a joint venture did not survive contact with these numbers. His father had received the majority of the company's proceeds during his lifetime. The cash my mother had been holding was not a recovery of Douglas's share. It was something else. The second thing that happened in August was a phone call to my cell from a number I didn't recognize. "Miss Marsh," the voice said, "my name is Thomas Aldridge. I'd like to speak with you directly, if you're willing." I was not supposed to have direct contact with him while the civil proceeding was pending. I knew that. He presumably knew it too. I said, "You should be speaking with my lawyer." "I understand," he said, "and I will continue to do so. I'm not calling to discuss the legal matter. I'm calling because—" He paused. "Because I think there are things about my father and your mother that neither of us fully understands, and I think we might both benefit from understanding them." His voice was not the voice I had built in my imagination. I had constructed someone aggressive, someone with the particular entitlement of a person who believes they've been cheated of something. This voice was tired. It sounded, honestly, like a man who had been through something difficult and wasn't sure it was over. I told him I would speak with my lawyer and call him back. I hung up. I forwarded the call log to Patricia and called her immediately. She was not pleased about the call. She was also, after I described the tone of it, thoughtfully quiet for a moment. "There are two possibilities," she said. "One is that he's fishing for information or trying to establish a sympathetic connection before the hearing. The other is that he actually has information about the arrangement that he hasn't disclosed through his counsel. Either way, he's not supposed to be calling you." She contacted Kevin Drury. Kevin, apparently, had not authorized the call. Patricia sent a formal letter. The calls stopped. But I thought about what Thomas had said, things about my father and your mother that neither of us fully understands. I had been assuming, since the beginning, that this was a story about money, about an arrangement that had generated cash, about liability and obligation and competing claims. I had been treating it the way I treat everything, as a problem of records, a question of traceability. Numbers had sources. Transactions had histories. You followed the line backward far enough, and you found the origin. What I hadn't considered until that phone call was that the origin might be something my mother had felt she owed not as a business obligation, but as a personal one. The document that shifted everything came from a direction I hadn't expected, not from the corporate filings, not from the forensic accountant, from the plastic storage bin in my mother's storage locker, the one with the bundled letters. I had gone through those letters once, briefly, in the weeks after my mother died, and had set them aside as personal correspondence. Letters from my father, from old friends, from relatives. I hadn't read them carefully. Grief has its own logic, and I hadn't been ready to sit with my mother's private voice. I went back to them on a Saturday in late August, after the phone call from Thomas Aldridge had put a different question in my head. I sat on my apartment floor with a cup of coffee, and I read every letter in that bin. Most of them were what I'd assumed. Letters from my father before they married, warm and slightly formal in the way of that generation. Letters from my mother's sister in Nova Scotia. A few from old colleagues. At the bottom of the second bundle, in an envelope I almost set aside, were 4 letters written to my mother by a woman named Margaret Aldridge, Thomas's mother. The letters spanned 2009 to 2015. I read them all. Then I read them again. They were the letters of 2 women who had known each other a long time and who had reached, over some years, a complicated understanding. What I pieced together from them carefully, because they were not explicit. These were women of a generation that was careful about putting things in writing. Was this: Douglas Aldridge had not been a straightforward man. He had operated, over the course of many years, in that gray territory where informal business arrangements shade into something less defensible. Margaret had known this. She had not fully known the details, but she had known the shape of it, and at some point my mother had been drawn into it, not for her own gain primarily, but to help Douglas, whom she had evidently known since before I was born, through community connections I had never been aware of, to manage and eventually wind down the financial arrangements he had built. My mother had been helping Douglas Aldridge clean up his books, slowly, carefully, over years, and the cash she had set aside was not a debt owed to his family. It was restitution, money she had calculated as the portion of the proceeds she had passed through her hands, that represented gain she was not comfortable keeping, that she wanted returned to the family, even though there was no legal mechanism to compel her to do so. Margaret Aldridge had known this. She had written in the last letter that she was grateful for what Ruth was doing, and that she hoped Thomas would understand when the time came. Thomas hadn't known. That was clear from the legal claim. He had understood the cash as his father's investment, not as his mother's private arrangement with my mother. I called Patricia on a Monday morning. "I need to tell you something," I said, and I told her about the letters. There was a long pause on the other end. Then she said, "Lydia, these letters change the character of this situation substantially. If we can demonstrate that the funds were set aside by your mother as voluntary restitution rather than as held assets belonging to the Aldridge estate, the civil claim loses most of its legal basis." But, she added carefully, "it also suggests that if we wanted to, we could return the money, the portion net of the tax liability, to Thomas Aldridge voluntarily, as your mother had apparently intended, and resolve this entire matter without a hearing." I had been thinking about that since Saturday. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday in the second week of September. The week before it, Patricia and I met with Kevin Drury and Thomas Aldridge at a boardroom in Kevin's Brantford office. Thomas Aldridge was 53 years old, heavier than I'd imagined from his voice on the phone, with the weathered look of a man who worked with his hands, which I later learned he did. He'd spent 20 years as a millwright after Aldridge Carthage dissolved. He sat across the table from me and looked like someone who had been in a long, exhausting dispute and wasn't sure what he was fighting for anymore. I put the letters on the table. Patricia walked Thomas and Kevin through what the letters established, what my mother had been doing, why she had set the money aside, and what she had intended it to mean. Thomas read his mother's letters twice. Slowly. When he looked up, his expression was not what I expected. It wasn't triumphant or relieved or suspicious. It was something quieter than all of those. Something that looked honestly like grief. He said, "I didn't know she was in contact with your mother." My mother, I mean. I didn't know any of this. I know, I said. I didn't know either. We agreed in that boardroom to withdraw the civil claim. Patricia and Kevin drafted a settlement document in which I agreed to transfer $101,000 to Thomas Aldridge. The $147,000 less the $14,000 in CRA liability and $32,000 in legal and administrative costs, as a voluntary transfer honoring my mother's stated intention. The transfer would be documented, reported to the CRA appropriately, and carry no admission of wrongdoing by either party or either estate. Kevin Drury, to his credit, moved through the process with efficiency and without drama. He had taken the case because Thomas had a plausible claim. When the claim's basis shifted, he adjusted his advice accordingly. That's what a good lawyer does. Thomas and I shook hands in the lobby of Kevin's building afterward. He said, "I'm sorry for the trouble this caused you. I think I jumped to conclusions about what that money meant." I said, "I think we were both working with incomplete information." He nodded. He looked, as I said, very tired. He said, "My mother thought very highly of yours. She mentioned her sometimes, when I was growing up. I didn't know what they were connected by until all of this. I wish I'd known her better. I didn't know what to say to that." I said, "So do I." The months after the settlement had the particular quality of time that follows an extended period of high stress, slower than usual, quieter, and strangely ordinary in ways that felt like gifts. I went back to work. I submitted payroll filings and HST returns and year-end reconciliations for my clients, and the familiarity of those tasks was genuinely a comfort. The storage locker I cleared out that October. I kept the photographs, the wedding album, my parents' letters to each other, and my grandmother's pearls, which I had always loved, and which my mother had apparently been keeping there because she wore them seldom and worried about losing them in the house. The rest I donated. The unit I canceled. I kept the letters from Margaret Aldridge. I had thought about that a long time. Those letters were not mine, strictly speaking. They were evidence of something private between two women who were now both gone. But they were also, in a way, the key to the whole thing, the piece of information that had turned an adversarial, proceeding into something that could be resolved with some dignity. I kept them in the same folder where I'd filed everything else, time-stamped and documented, and I suspect I will keep them for a long time. My mother, Ruth Marsh, had been a complicated person. I had known her as practical and reserved and reliable, and occasionally infuriatingly indirect, about things she found difficult to say plainly. I had not known that she had spent years quietly helping to repair someone else's financial mistakes, not for profit, and not for recognition, but because she felt it was right. I had not known that she had prepared $147,000 in a storage locker as a kind of posthumous apology to a family she had never mentioned to me. I was not angry at her. I want to be careful about saying that because I think the easy narrative would be for me to feel betrayed by her secrecy, and I don't, quite. What I feel is something more like a complicated addition to my understanding of her, the sense that a person you knew well had an entire dimension you never saw, and that the dimensions, once revealed, doesn't make them a stranger, just more fully themselves. My cousin Beverly, who I eventually told most of it to, said, "Well, that's your mother all over, isn't it? Sorting out somebody else's mess and not telling anyone about it." She was right. It was exactly her. I did not inherit a windfall. I inherited a responsibility, and I discharged it, and the estate was smaller for it, and I think that is the correct outcome. What I did keep, apart from the photographs and the pearls and the letters, was a practice. I had always been meticulous about documentation in my work, After all of this, I became meticulous about it in everything. Every conversation that mattered, every agreement, every decision with consequences. Not from paranoia, from the understanding that clarity, even when it's uncomfortable, is almost always kinder than the alternative. Patricia Holloway sent me a card when the settlement was finalized. It said simply, "Well handled." I put it on my refrigerator, where it stayed for the better part of a year. The storage locker key I still have. It sits in a small dish on my windowsill with the things I keep there. A coin from a trip I took years ago. A button from my father's coat. The key to a bike lock I no longer own. I'm not sure why I kept it. Partly, I think, because it represents the thing that started all of this. The moment when the key appeared in the junk drawer and nothing was simple anymore. And partly because I have come to believe that the things we don't understand about the people we love are not absences. They're invitations, if we're willing to follow them far enough to find out what they mean. My mother left me with a question, not an answer. I am still, in some ways, working through it. That's the whole story. Not a clean one, not a triumphant one, but mine and hers and true. So tell me, have you ever found some after losing someone that changed how you understood them? I read every comment, and if this story stayed with you, please subscribe and let me know where you're listening from. I'm always glad to know how false stories can travel.